Hey everyone, I thought I would do a quick lecture on the article that you've been reading on Genesis and the abundant life. A little backdrop to that article that was written for an independent study that I was doing with Mark Futato as I was entering into my PhD program. My master's was in philosophy of religion and ethics, and so as I was entering into my PhD program, I had to do a little bit of Old Testament, New Testament, and church history in preparation for a PhD in theology and ethics. So I TA'd for Mark Futato, and then I did an independent study, and this was kind of the result of it as I was writing my final paper. So I had, of course, I had some questions about Genesis that I wanted to answer, and I found Futato's work excellent in helping me answer some of those questions. But then, as God works in my own life, just personally, I usually have something like I'm studying scripture, I'm reading through it, but there's usually a passage that sticks in my mind and in my heart for quite a while. In this case, it was John chapter 10, verse 10. I came that they might have life and have it abundantly. This is one of the first passages that was introduced to me when I was a college student, and somebody shared their faith with me, and read this passage, and I kind of passed over it then, but as life got a little more complex and a little more difficult, I had questions about what does the abundant life mean. I also had questions because I grew up in a very strong and traditional evangelical culture with a focus kind of on soteriology and salvation and heaven in such a way that I felt like some things with life were getting neglected when we talked about the importance of the gospel of Jesus Christ throughout all of our life. And especially important to me were concerns about justice and how justice got and ideas about social justice got looped into the fundamentalist modernist controversy, where conservative Christians who focused on the authority and inerrancy of the scriptures, who focused on the reality of personal sin, who focused on the necessity of salvation and the real miracles, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, all on the conservative side of the fundamentalist modernist controversy. So if you're going to solve the problem of personal sin, then you do evangelism. And then on the liberal side of that controversy, or the progressive side, was the problem is defined as societal, structural, institutional sin. And the solution to that was systemic and social justice, and then also education. And so as I grew up in my own Christian faith, there was a strong split to that early on. And so if you're into justice questions, if you're into taking care of the poor, first of all, as conservatives, the way that you do that is you share your faith so that people's hearts will change. And as the aggregate number of hearts change, then societal change will happen. And so if you're going to move in that direction, like say, take part in a faith-based group that works on justice questions, then that's a slippery slope down to liberalism or progressivism and giving up the authority of the Bible, giving up miracles, giving up the actual resurrection of Christ, etc. And so, so this was a little bit of an attempt to wrestle with some of those questions. As you see in those relationships that I articulate in the article, the 5 relationships, both that are created good. So this is a picture, and it's a poetic picture, so the details aren't filled in, but it's a picture of what it means to have an abundant life and have a life in how God originally created it. And then, of course, that gets corrupted quickly by sin in Genesis chapter 3. So life gets thwarted at all angles in relationship with God, in relationship with others, through work, the environment, and even your understanding of yourself and your place in the world. And so how I, in that context, view love and view justice is that love is taking what we have and what's within our power. And I just define power as Dallas Willard defines it, as the effective range of your will. So if you will something to happen and you can make it happen, then that's within your power. So love is using the things within your power to help others flourish. Justice, and I mentioned this earlier, is the flip side of that. That what you do with the power that you have is you help to stop things. So they may be systemic, they may be personal, they may be institutional, etc. But you work to stop them from preventing people from flourishing. And this is going to be an important part of the conversation as we move into the conversation on race that you're going to be reading with Andrew Sung Park and Racial Conflict and Healing, and the conversation that will continue as we look at Randy Woodley's book on Shalom. And so the idea of having an understanding and a picture of what flourishing looks like, having an understanding of how we use our power, and we'll look a little bit more in Philippians chapter 2 about how Jesus used his power and how he models it for us in Mark 10 as well. And then so using our power to help others flourish, both in acts of love and in acts of justice. And so we'll talk a little bit about tzedakah and its family of derivatives of words that the scriptures use. Righteousness and justice usually mean to be properly related to one another, both in relationship with God and in those other four relationships. So so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's how I see love and justice fitting together in our work in the gospel and spreading God's kingdom. The only other thing that I want to say is how we corrupt ourselves in Genesis chapter 3, and how that corruption of sin weaves through all of our personal life and all of the institutions and structures in society, is that we tend to go two directions with it. One is we can idolize a relationship. In other words, we can make it more important than it should be. So we do this in my area, we do this in Silicon Valley with work. We make work a little more important than what it should be. So if you're not working 80 hours and you don't have a side company, then who are you, basically? So we tend to overemphasize and idolize work. We can do this with marriage. We can do this with other kinds of relationships. We can even do this with ourselves, trying to place too much of an emphasis on who we are and our importance in the world. So we can do that in one direction. The other direction is we can trivialize those relationships, so we can make them less important than what they should be in our lives. And I think that the redemptive work of Christ and the good news of the gospel is that that Jesus's work applies to all five of those relationships, not just your relationship with God, the vertical one, but all of the relationships. The relationship with God is the center relationship. It's the hub around which all the other relationships kind of rotate. And so we want to keep that in mind. That's what Proverbs 1:7 says. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. That's what the Shema is. That's what John 14:6 is. I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. So continually, God is, even Matthew 22, love God and love your neighbor as yourself, the great commandment. There are these centering passages throughout Scripture that orient us to God as the fundamental relationship in which all relationships need to orbit in order to find their appropriate place. And so as we think about racial justice, the conflict that comes between othering and what we do when we create an other, and the continual emphasis of the scriptures on pushing our moral boundaries of inclusion outward to others that are not like us, we're going to keep this in mind. These 5 relationships, each of these relationships we're thinking holistically about how people can flourish both as individuals and as groups of people. Okay, I think that's enough for today. Let's just a quick reminder to get started on your reading, Racial Conflict and Healing. You have a book next week and a book the week after, and so that's a pretty brisk pace for reading. So I think you want to try to get a head start if you can, and then jump into the forum or the discussion on the article. I think there's some interesting conversation that's happening in that discussion. All right. I hope you all have had a great week, and we'll look forward to jumping into next week.